The night was heavy with rain, the kind that made everything outside feel distant and eerie. Sophie adjusted the wipers of her car as she drove through the winding road leading to David's mansion. The trees on either side seemed to stretch into the darkness, and the sound of thunder rumbled in the distance. Beside her, Bee sat quietly, her hands resting nervously on her lap. It was her first time meeting Sophie's friends, and though Sophie had assured her it would be fine, Bee couldn't shake off the nervous energy. "What is the plan? You're going to love them," Sophie said, glancing at Bee with a smile. Bee managed a small smile in return. "I hope so. They're your closest friends after all." "They're a bit intense," Sophie admitted, laughing softly. "But they're good people, mostly." Bee nodded, but the pit in her stomach didn't go away. The mansion came into view, a towering structure with large glass windows and modern architecture. It stood isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. The rain made the glass shimmer under the faint glow of the lights inside. Sophie parked the car, and they stepped out, quickly running toward the door. The sound of music grew louder as they approached, the Mona Carta sound of lights rushing through the walls. "Here we go," Sophie said, pushing open the door. Inside, the air was warm and filled with laughter. A group of people was gathered in the living room, some lounging on the oversized couches, others dancing to the music. "Look who decided to show up," David's voice boomed across the room. He was standing by the bar, a drink in hand, his energy loud and magnetic. Sophie smiled and waved. "Hey, David." David's grin widened. "And you brought someone new." He walked over, his eyes scanning Bee. "You must be welcome to the madness." Bee shook his hand, feeling slightly overwhelmed. "Thanks. It's nice to meet you." "Come on," Sophie said, taking Bee's hand. "I'll introduce you to everyone." They moved around the room, Sophie pointing out her friends. "That's Emma," Sophie said, gesturing toward a girl with sharp features and a confident demeanor. "She's smart, but never lets you forget it." Bee nodded politely as Emma gave her a quick smile. "And over there is Jordan," Sophie continued. Jordan was sitting by herself, her expression unreadable. When their eyes met, Bee felt a strange tension, like Jordan was sizing her up. "Hi," Bee said softly. Jordan nodded, but didn't say anything. As the introductions continued, Bee noticed one thing. They all seemed close, but there was an underlying tension she couldn't ignore. The night went on, and the group drank, laughed, and danced. David turned the music up, shouting, "Let's make this a night to remember." At some point, someone suggested playing a game. "How about bodies, bodies, bodies?" Emma said, a mischievous smile on her face. Bee looked at Sophie, confused. "What's that?" "It's a murder mystery game," Sophie explained. "One person is the killer, and the rest of us have to figure out who it is before they kill everyone. It's fun, David said, slamming his drink down on the table. Until people start accusing each other. Isn't that the whole point? Emma teased. David laughed. Exactly. The group gathered in the living room, the rules explained quickly. Each person drew a piece of paper, one of which secretly assigned someone as the killer. The lights would go off, and the killer would strike by tapping their victim on the back. When the lights came back on, the group would have to figure out who the killer was. It seemed simple enough, but the air was already thick with anticipation. The lights went out. For a moment, there was silence, except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. Bee's heart raced as she stood in the darkness, unsure of what to expect. A scream pierced the silence, followed by nervous laughter. The lights flickered back on. David was lying on the floor, pretending to be dead, his tongue sticking out comically. "David's out," Emma announced, laughing. The accusations began immediately. "It's definitely Sophie," Jordan said, her tone sharp. "She's too quiet." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Or maybe it's you, Jordan. You always love playing the villain." "I think it's Emma," David chimed in, still lying on the floor. "She's always the first to accuse someone else." The arguments went back and forth, the room filling with laughter and playful accusations. But then, as the game continued, something changed. The lights went off again, and this time the darkness felt heavier. There was a sound, a loud thud, followed by another scream. When the lights came back on, Emma was on the floor, motionless. "Emma?" Sophie said, kneeling beside her. "This isn't funny." Emma didn't respond. David walked over, his face pale. He touched her shoulder and froze. "She's not breathing," he whispered. A cold wave of fear swept through the room. This isn't part of the game," Bee said, her voice trembling. "No," David said, stepping back. "It's not." They all looked at each other, the realization sinking in. Someone in the room wasn't playing a game. Someone had actually killed Emma. Emma's lifeless body lay in the center of the room, her once sharp and confident demeanor now hauntingly still. The group stared in stunned silence, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on their pale faces. "Is she really dead?" Bee asked, her voice trembling. David knelt beside Emma, pressing his fingers against her neck. He shook his head slowly, his face ashen. "She's gone." "No," Sophie whispered, stepping back, her hands covering her mouth. "This can't be real. It was just a game." "Games don't end like this," Jordan snapped, her voice rising. "Someone did this. Someone in this room killed her." "Killed her." The tension in the air became unbearable. The sound of the rain against the glass windows grew louder. like it was mocking the growing chaos inside. "All right, everyone just calm down," David said, standing up. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a shaky attempt at control. "We need to figure out what's happening." "Calm down," Jordan shot back, glaring at him. "There's a dead body in the middle of the room, and you want us to be calm? I'm just saying, panicking won't help," David argued. Bea felt her knees weaken. She reached for Sophie's arm, seeking some sense of stability. "We have to call the police," she said quietly. "No," David said immediately, his tone firm. "What do you mean, no?" Sophie asked, her voice sharp. David ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "Think about it. We're in the middle of nowhere, during a storm. The cops won't get here anytime soon. And if they do, what do you think they'll see? A group of drunk friends with a dead body? They'll think we're all suspects." "We are all suspects," Jordan muttered, crossing her arms. Bea looked around the room, her eyes darting from one face to another. The laughter and teasing from earlier were gone, replaced by fear and suspicion. "Okay, so what do we do?" Zara asked nervously, breaking her silence for the first time. David took a deep breath. "We stay here. We stick together. No one leaves this room until we figure out what happened." The group moved to sit in a rough circle, their faces lit by the dim overhead light. The storm outside raged on, the sound of thunder shaking the windows. "Let's go over what happened," David said, taking charge. "Emma was alive before the lights went out. When they came back on, she was dead. That means whoever did this had to act in the dark." "Brilliant deduction, Sherlock," Jordan said sarcastically. "Do you have something better to contribute?" David snapped. "Yeah," Jordan shot back. "Who's to say it wasn't you? You were closest to her when the lights went out." David's eyes widened. "Me? Are you serious?" "It's always the loudest person," Jordan said coldly. "You like being the center of attention. Maybe you thought killing her would make you the star of the night." "That's insane," David yelled, standing up. "Enough," Sophie said, her voice cutting through the argument. "Pointing fingers isn't helping. We don't know who did this, and blaming each other won't change that." Jordan leaned back, her gaze icy. "Fine, but don't think I'm letting my guard down." The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Bea shifted nervously, her eyes darting toward Sophie. "Do you think it could have been someone from outside?" Bea asked quietly. "Like who?" David scoffed. "We're in the middle of nowhere. No one else is here." "Are you sure about that?" Bea countered. Her question hung in the air, stirring a fresh wave of unease. "Okay," Zara said, her voice shaky. "What if we go in pairs? Check the house? Make sure we're alone?" "That's the worst idea I've ever heard," Jordan said flatly. "Splitting up? Do you want us all to die?" "Well, you can't just sit here," Zara snapped, tears forming in her eyes. "We're safer together," Sophie said firmly. David sighed and ran his hands over his face. "All right, fine. We'll stay here. but we can't just sit in silence all night." "What do you suggest?" Sophie asked. David looked at them one by one. "We talk. We figure out what each of us was doing when the lights went out." The questioning began. David spoke first. "I was standing by the table, near the drinks. I didn't move when the lights went off." "Convenient," Jordan muttered. "What about you?" David shot back. "You're always so quick to accuse. Maybe it was you." Jordan rolled her eyes. "I was by the couch, if you must know. And no, I didn't kill her." Zara spoke up next, her voice trembling. "I was near the fireplace. I didn't hear or see anything." Bee's turn came, and she hesitated. "I was by the bookshelf. I didn't move either." "And you, Sophie?" David asked. Sophie hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Jordan to notice. "Why are you pausing, Sophie?" Jordan asked, narrowing her eyes. "I'm not pausing," Sophie said defensively. "I was standing near Bee, that's all." The tension in the room thickened, each answer only raising more questions. As the storm raged on, the group fell into a tense silence. The fear of the unknown loomed large, and the knowledge that one of them might be a killer gnawed at their sanity. And then the lights went out again. This time, the darkness was suffocating. There was a loud crash, followed by the sound of footsteps. "Who's there?" Bee called out, her voice trembling. No answer. When the lights flickered back on, Zara was lying on the floor, blood pooling around her. "Oh my God," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. She's dead," David said, backing away. The group stood frozen, the realization hitting them like a tidal wave. This wasn't over. Someone was still killing. Zara's lifeless body lay in the middle of the room, her face frozen in an expression of shock. The group stood paralyzed, their breaths shallow, as the sound of rain and distant thunder filled the silence. "No, no, no," Sophie whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be happening. Not again." "We have to get out of here. We can't just stay and wait to be next." "We can't leave," David yelled, his voice echoing off the walls. "There's a killer out there, or in here. If we leave, we're just splitting ourselves up. It's suicide." "Staying here is suicide," Jordan snapped, glaring at him. "Or do you want to explain why Zara was killed right after you started questioning everyone?" David's face twisted with anger. "Why do you keep accusing me, Jordan? You're the one acting suspicious." "Starting with because you're a liar," Jordan shot back. "You always have to be in control. You think this is some twisted game you can win." "That's enough," Sophie shouted, her voice cracking. "We're falling apart, and that's exactly what whoever's doing this wants." The room went quiet, but the tension was unbearable. The group huddled near the corner of the living room, far from Zara's body. Bee couldn't stop glancing at the blood pooling on the floor, her stomach churning with fear. "We need to think," Sophie said, her voice trembling but determined. We need to figure this out before it's too late. There's nothing to figure out, Jordan muttered. One of us is doing this. One of us killed Zara. One of us killed Zara. Yes. Bee looked at the faces around her. David, angry and defensive. Jordan, cold and calculating. Sophie, trying to hold everything together. She felt the weight of their suspicion hanging in the air, and for the first time she wondered if she really knew any of them. We don't have much time, Sophie continued. We stick together, no one moves alone, and we... The lights went out again. Panic erupted. Stay where you are, Sophie shouted, her voice barely audible over the sound of footsteps and crashing furniture. Bee's heart raced as she clung to the wall, her breathing shallow. The darkness was suffocating, and every noise seemed amplified. The shuffle of feet, the heavy breathing, the sound of something falling to the floor. Then a scream. The lights flickered back on, dim and unsteady. David was lying on the floor, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his shirt as he gasped for air. "Help me!" he choked out, his eyes wide with terror. Sophie rushed to his side, pressing her hands against the wound. "You're gonna be okay. Just hold on." David coughed, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. It wasn't me," he whispered. "We know," Sophie said, tears streaming down her face. David's hand fell limp, his head turning to the side. He was gone. The remaining three stood in silence, their faces pale and their bodies trembling. "3 people are dead," Jordan said, her voice hollow, "and we're just sitting here, waiting to join them." "Jordan, stop," Sophie said, her voice barely steady. "We need to stay calm." "Calm?" Jordan laughed bitterly. "You think calm is going to save us? Look around, Sophie. There's no saving anyone. We're all going to die." "Not if we work together," Sophie said firmly. Jordan narrowed her eyes. "And how do I know it's not you? You've been playing the peacemaker all night, but that doesn't mean you're innocent. I'm trying to keep us alive," Sophie snapped. "Enough," Bee said quietly, her voice cutting through their argument. Both women turned to her. "This is exactly what the killer wants," Bee continued, her voice trembling but resolute. "They want us to turn on each other. But we're not going to. We're going to figure this out." "How?" Jordan asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. Bee hesitated. "We start with what we know. Emma died during the first blackout, Zara during the second, David during the third. That means the killer had to be close enough to act each time." Jordan folded her arms. "And where were you during those times, Bee?" Bee froze, her heart pounding. I was with Sophie," she said, her voice faltering. "And what about you, Sophie?" Jordan pressed. "Can you vouch for her?" Sophie hesitated, and in that moment, Bee felt the fragile trust between them crack. The tension boiled over. Jordan stepped closer, her eyes blazing, You've been quiet all night, Bee. Too quiet. Maybe you're the one we should have been watching. Bee backed away, her hands raised defensively. I didn't do anything. Why would I? Wouldn't you? Jordan countered. You're new. You don't know us. Maybe you thought you could get away with it. Stop it, Jordan, Sophie shouted, stepping between them. This isn't helping. Jordan's eyes flicked to Sophie, her suspicion growing. Or maybe you're protecting her because you're in on it together. Sophie's face hardened. You're being ridiculous. Am I? Jordan sneered. Before anyone could say another word, the lights flickered off again. This time, the darkness felt endless. Bee's breathing quickened as she pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing. A loud crash echoed through the room, followed by a muffled scream. When the lights came back on, Sophie was standing in the center of the room, her hands covered in blood. Jordan lay at her feet, motionless. Bee stared in horror. Sophie, what did you do? Sophie's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't me. I swear, Bee, it wasn't me. Bee backed away, her heart pounding. You're the only one left. No, Sophie said, her voice desperate. Bee, please. You have to believe me. But Bee couldn't. In the end, the truth was buried beneath fear and mistrust, and the storm outside raged on. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share. See you in the next video.